On a Tuesday morning in October of 1987, a man named Merle Gustafson walked into a diesel shop in Hardin County, Iowa, and set a Stanadyne DB4 injection pump on the counter like he was setting down a sick child. He was 61 years old. He had farmed 480 acres of corn and soybeans east of Eldora for 38 years, and the pump in his hands had been pulled from a John Deere 4.24. Oh, that was sitting cold in his machine shed with a full tank of fuel it couldn't use. Harvest was 3 weeks out. The ground was firm. The corn was ready. The tractor was not. And the nearest shop that could touch a diesel injection pump was 14 miles up Highway 175, a place called Reinhardt Diesel, run by a man named Dale Reinhardt, who had been rebuilding injection pumps, injectors, and governors since 1959. Merle set the pump on the counter and said, "She's surging at half throttle, and she's smoking black." Dale Reinhardt looked at the pump for exactly 2 seconds and said, "Leave it." Merle was back in his field by Thursday. Let me tell you about Dale Reinhardt, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what happened when he was gone. Dale was 54 years old in 1987, which meant he had been working on diesel fuel systems since he was 17. He had started as a bench apprentice at a Caterpillar dealership in Grundy Center, sweeping floors and handing tools to a man named Irvin Schaefer, who had learned the trade in the Army during the Korean War and who believed that a diesel injection pump was the most precise mechanical object a farm boy was ever likely to touch. Irvin was not wrong. The tolerances inside a Stanadyne or a Bosch or a Cav pump are measured in 10,000ths of an inch. The plungers and barrels that meter fuel are lapped to fit each other so precisely that they are not interchangeable with any other pump in the world, even one of the same model, even one built the same day on the same line. Each pump is its own closed system. Each one is unique. Dale learned this from Irvin Schaefer before he was old enough to vote, and it shaped everything that came after. He opened Reinhardt Diesel in 1971 in a cinder block building on the north edge of Eldora. Population 3,000, county seat of Hardin County, Iowa. He had a Sun diagnostic machine, a Hartridge test stand, a parts washer that smelled like kerosene and regret, and enough hand tools to fill 2 rolling cabinets. He had a reputation, which in a county of 21,000 people was worth more than any of the equipment. Farmers talk. Word travels from one end of a township to the other before the coffee gets cold at the elevator. If Dale Reinhardt fixed your pump and it ran clean and didn't surge and didn't smoke, you told your neighbor, and your neighbor told his son-in-law, and his son-in-law told the guy he bought hay from. Within 5 years of opening, Dale had more work than he could turn away. Within 10, he had a waiting list that ran 3 weeks deep from April through October. Let me tell you about what that shop meant to Hardin County, because it's important to understand the weight of a thing before you understand what it means to lose it. In the 1970s and 1980s, diesel power was everything on an Iowa corn farm. Not gasoline, not propane. Diesel. The tractors that pulled the tillage and planted the corn and ran the combines were all diesel, and the fuel systems that made them run were precision instruments built to tolerances that most mechanics had never been trained to touch. The dealerships could swap a pump for a remanufactured one, and sometimes they did, and sometimes that worked fine. But a Rumman pump cost money that not every farmer had, especially after 1980, when the farm crisis started squeezing Hardin County the same way it squeezed every county in Iowa. Land values had peaked and were falling. Interest rates were north of 15%. Corn was $2.50 a bushel and heading lower. Every dollar that could be saved was a dollar that stayed on the farm. And if Dale Reinhardt could rebuild your original pump for a third of what a rumman cost, you drove to Eldora and you set it on his counter and you said, "Ma, she's surging," and you went home and waited. Farmers came to that shop from all over Hardin County, and from the edges of the counties that touched it, Grundy to the south, Franklin to the north, Hamilton to the west. They came with Stanadyne DB2 and DB4 pumps off John Deere tractors. They came with Rusa Master pumps off old Internationals. They came with Bosch inline pumps off big Alice Chalmers and Minneapolis Moline machines that were old enough to have been their fathers. They came with CAV pumps off British Fords that had no business still being in service but were still being run because they still worked, and the payment on them was zero. Dale fixed them all. He kept a ledger, not a computer, a paper ledger, with every pump he'd ever worked on, the customer's name, the tractor model, the pump serial number, the fault, the repair, the parts used, the date. By 1987, that ledger had more than 4,000 entries. By 1995, it had more than 7,000. By the time things started to change, it had entries going back 25 years, and Dale could look at a serial number and tell you what he'd done to that pump the last time it came in. Now let me tell you about the thing that changed, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most things happen in farming country. Slowly, then faster, then all at once. The first sign was the parts. Injection pump parts had always been available through specialty suppliers, Ambac, Standard Motor Products, a handful of others, and Dale had accounts with all of them. He ordered plungers and barrels, delivery valves, governor springs, advance pistons, O-rings and seals in bulk because he went through them steadily. But sometime around 2000, he started noticing that certain part numbers were being discontinued. Not the common ones, not yet, but the ones for the older pumps. The Rusa Masters off the 560 Internationals, the CAV units off the early Ford 5000s. The suppliers were thinning their catalogs. The market for parts for 40-year-old injection pumps was, in the cold arithmetic of a parts distributor, not worth maintaining. Dale started buying extra stock when he could find it. He started calling salvage dealers and other shops that were closing. He started pulling good parts from cores that came in too far gone to rebuild, bagging them and labeling them and putting them on shelves in the back room. He didn't say much about it. That was his way. He didn't complain to his customers, didn't post a sign in the window, didn't call the county extension office to report a trend. He just watched it happening and started preparing for it the way a man who has farmed through droughts prepares for the next one, quietly, methodically, without drama. Let me tell you about the customers who came to that bench, because they were not abstractions. They were specific people with specific machines and specific problems, and Dale Reinhardt knew all of them by name. There was Emmett Hassel, who farmed 600 acres east of Iowa Falls and who ran a pair of John Deere 4430s that he refused to trade because he said the new tractors had too many computers and not enough iron. Emmett came in every 2 or 3 years with a DB4 that was running rough, and Dale fixed it every time, and Emmett paid cash and never asked for a receipt. There was Lyle Kowalski, who ran a small custom combining operation and who had 4 old Gleaner combines that he kept running through sheer stubbornness and Dale Reinhardt's skill. There was Vera Sorensen, who had taken over her late husband's operation in 1991 and who came in once with a pump off an old white tractor and stood at the counter and said she didn't know what was wrong with it, only that it wouldn't start in the cold, and Dale had it back to her in 2 days. There was a young man named Caleb Dykstra who had just started farming with his father and who brought in a pump off a used tractor he'd bought at auction, a pump that turned out to have been sleeved wrong by someone who didn't know what they were doing, and Dale had spent the better part of a day undoing the damage before he could begin the actual repair. These were the people who carried their pumps to that bench. Not once, not twice. For 15 years, for some of them. For the whole of their farming lives, for others. The shop was as much a part of their operation as the grain elevator or the implement dealer. It was the place you went when the thing that made your engine run had stopped running right, and the man behind the bench knew what to do about it. Let me tell you about what Dale Reinhardt knew, because it's not something you can summarize quickly and do it justice. A diesel injection pump is not like other mechanical components. It doesn't wear in ways that are easy to see or easy to measure without the right equipment. A pump that is delivering too much fuel will make your engine smoke black and run hot. A pump that is delivering too little will make it smoke white and lose power. A pump with a worn metering valve will surge at part throttle, hunting for a fuel delivery rate it can't hold steady. A pump with a failing advance mechanism will start hard when cold and ping under load. A pump with a stuck delivery valve will cause one cylinder to misfire in a pattern so subtle that most mechanics will blame the injectors instead of the pump and replace 4 injectors that don't need replacing before they figure out what's actually wrong. Dale could hear these problems. Not metaphorically, literally. He could listen to an engine run for 30 seconds and tell you whether the problem was in the pump or the injectors or somewhere else entirely. He could put a pump on his Hartridge test stand and read the fuel delivery curves the way another man reads a newspaper. He knew what the numbers were supposed to be. He knew what they meant when they weren't right. He knew which components wore in which sequence and which failures were predictable and which ones were surprises and what a surprise failure usually pointed to underneath. This knowledge was not written down anywhere in a form that was easy to transfer. It lived in Dale Reinhardt's hands and in his eyes and in the 35 years of pattern recognition that had accumulated in the part of his brain that processed what he saw on the test stand. He had taught 2 apprentices over the years, young men who had worked with him for a while and then moved on to other things, and neither of them had stayed long enough to absorb what he knew at the level he knew it. The knowledge was his, and it was deep, and it was irreplaceable. And in 2002, Dale Reinhardt had a heart attack. He survived it. He came back to the shop after 6 weeks, thinner and quieter, and he worked for another 3 years. But the heart attack had changed something in the arithmetic of his life, and in the spring of 2005 he sat down with his wife Norma, and they talked about it, and in June of that year, Dale Reinhardt closed Reinhardt Diesel. He was 72 years old. He had been rebuilding injection pumps for 55 years. He locked the door on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning, Hardin County had no diesel injection pump specialist. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When a hardware store closes in a small town, people notice. They write letters to the editor. They organize a committee. They talk about it at the coffee shop for a month. But when a specialist closes, when the one man in a county who knows how to do a specific thing decides he's done, it's quieter than that. The loss doesn't announce itself. It just becomes apparent, slowly, The next time you need the thing he knew how to do. For the farmers of Hardin County, the next time came quickly. Emmett Hassel's DB4 started surging in August of 2005, 2 months after Dale closed the shop. Emmett called the John Deere dealer in Eldora, and they said they could put a remanufactured pump on it, and the pump would cost $680, and the labor would be another $180, and it would take 2 weeks to get the pump in. Emmett said he'd think about it. He called around to 2 other shops in the region, one in Marshalltown and one in Ames. The Marshalltown shop said they didn't work on injection pumps anymore, hadn't for years, that the liability wasn't worth it. The Ames shop said they could look at it, but their guy who knew injection pumps had retired and the new guy was still learning. Emmett ended up buying the remanufactured pump from the dealer. It cost him $860 all in, and it ran fine. But he was aware that Dale Reinhardt would have fixed his original pump for $200 and had it back to him in a week. Lyle Kowalski had a worse experience. One of his gleaners developed an injection problem in September of 2005, right in the middle of harvest. And the pump on that combine was a Bosch inline unit that the dealer had never seen before, and the Ames shop had no parts for. Lyle ended up pulling the combine out of service for the season. He hired a custom cutter to finish his acres, which cost him $4,200 that he hadn't planned to spend. He found a rebuilt pump the following spring from a dealer in Minnesota, but it was a different calibration than his original, and the engine never ran quite right after that. Vera Sorensen drove to 3 different towns, looking for someone who could work on the CAV pump off her white tractor. She ended up shipping it to a specialty shop in Illinois, and the turnaround was 6 weeks, and the bill was $490 plus freight both ways. The shop in Illinois did good work, she said later, but they didn't know her tractor. They didn't know that the pump had been rebuilt once before, in 1994, and what had been done to it then. Dale had known. It was in his ledger. The ledger. Let me tell you about the ledger because it became important in a way that nobody had anticipated. When Dale Reinhardt closed the shop, he took the ledger home. It was a standard composition book, hard-bound, the kind you buy at a school supply store, and he had filled 14 of them over the course of his career. He kept them on a shelf in his basement, in order labeled by year range on the spine in his careful block printing. He hadn't thought of them as anything particular. They were his records. Every business kept records. But the ledger contained something that no other document in Hardin County contained. A complete service history for several thousand injection pumps, tied to specific serial numbers, tied to specific farms, tied to specific machines. It was, in effect, a medical record for the diesel hearts of Hardin County agriculture. And it was sitting on a shelf in a retired man's basement, and nobody knew it existed except Dale and Norma. Let me tell you about what happened in the fall of 2006, because that's when the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Emmett Hassel's second 4.43 started running rough in September. The DB4 on that tractor had been rebuilt by Dale in 1999, and Emmett knew it, and he also knew that the problem felt like the same kind of surgeon he'd had on the first tractor the year before. He called the dealer. He called the Marshalltown shop. He called the Ames shop. And then, because he was a man who had run out of options and was not too proud to knock on a door, he drove to Dale Reinhardt's house on a Wednesday evening in October and knocked on the door. Dale answered it in his slippers. Emmett explained the situation. He said he was sorry to bother him. He said he knew Dale was retired. He said he didn't know where else to go. Dale listened to all of it without interrupting, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Bring it by Saturday morning." He didn't open the shop. The shop was sold, the building leased to a welding supply company. But Dale's bench tools were in his garage, and his Hartridge test stand was in the back of the garage under a tarp, and his parts inventory, the one he'd spent years accumulating from discontinued suppliers and salvage dealers and closing shops, was in the basement next to the ledgers, organized on metal shelving and labeled bins. He had taken it all home when he closed because he hadn't known what else to do with it, and because some part of him had understood, even then, that it might still be useful. Emmett brought the pump on Saturday. Dale put it on the stand, ran the test sequence, read the curves, opened it up, found a worn metering valve and a governor spring that had lost its calibration. He had both parts in his basement. The repair took 4 hours. He charged Emmett $90 for parts and nothing for labor. Emmett tried to argue about the labor. Dale said, "Don't." Word got out. Of course it did. This is Hardin County, Iowa, population 18,000, where the distance between a secret and common knowledge is approximately 1 phone call. By November, 2 more farmers had called Dale's house. By the following spring, he had a quiet, unofficial, completely unannounced operation running out of his garage on Saturday mornings, and sometimes Wednesday afternoons, and occasionally in the evenings when someone had a harvest emergency and couldn't wait. He never advertised. He never put a sign in the yard. He never called it a business or filed a license or told anyone officially that he was doing it. He just answered the phone when it rang, and he said, "Bring it by," and he fixed it. Let me tell you about the people who found out about Dale's garage, because the way they found out says something important about how information travels in a farming community. It wasn't the internet. In 2006, most of the farmers calling Dale's phone were men in their 50s and 60s who got their information the way they'd always gotten it, from other farmers, at the elevator, at the co-op, at the implement dealer's parts counter. Someone would mention that their pump was running rough, and someone else would say, "You talked to Dale Reinhardt?" And the first person would say, "I thought he was retired." And the second person would say, "He is, but call him anyway." That was the entire referral system. It was word of mouth in its purest form, operating through a network of men who had known each other for decades, and who trusted each other's recommendations the way they trusted the weather forecast less and their own experience more. The younger farmers found out differently. Caleb Dykstra, who had brought in that misrepaired pump years earlier, had started using online forums for equipment advice, the kind of places where farmers asked questions about old iron and got answers from other farmers who'd dealt with the same problems. He posted about his injection pump trouble in a forum thread, and someone in the thread said there was a retired specialist in Eldora, Iowa, who was doing informal work out of his garage. Caleb recognized the description immediately. He called the number. Dale answered. "Bring it by." By 2008, Dale was seeing 30 to 40 pumps a year out of his garage. Not the volume he'd had at the shop, but not nothing either. And the people coming to him were increasingly desperate, because the options that had existed in 2005 were continuing to shrink. The Ames shop's injection pump man had retired and not been replaced. A shop in Waterloo that had done some of this work had closed entirely. The specialty supplier in Illinois that Vera Sorensen had used had stopped taking new customers because their backlog was too long. The world, that had once contained multiple options for a farmer with a sick injection pump, was becoming a world that contained very few, and then fewer, and Dale Reinhardt's garage was becoming, for a certain radius around Eldora, Iowa, the last option. Let me tell you about what Dale was working with in that garage, because the equipment matters. The Hartridge test stand was a British machine, built in the 1960s, that Dale had bought used in 1974 for $1,800. It was a device for calibrating and testing injection pumps. It drove the pump at controlled speeds, measured fuel delivery in precise volumes, and allowed the technician to compare actual delivery curves against specification. Modern shops used computerized versions of the same basic concept, but the computerized versions cost $40,000 and up and were designed for modern common rail systems, not for the mechanical pumps that Dale worked on. His Hartridge did exactly what it needed to do for the pumps he was seeing, and it did it with the kind of mechanical directness that he understood in his bones. He had rebuilt it twice. He knew every component in it. He trusted it the way he trusted his own hands. His hand tools were a mixture of standard and specialized. The specialized ones, the pump-holding fixtures and the timing tools, the seal installation drivers, were things he had made himself over the years, or had bought from suppliers who no longer existed, or had inherited from Irvin Schaefer, who had made some of them himself. These tools were not available for purchase. They existed because Dale or Irvin had needed them and had made them, and they worked because the men who made them understood precisely what they were for. And then there were the parts. The shelves in Dale's basement held a collection that had taken 30 years to assemble, not systematically, not with any grand plan, but opportunistically, the way a man who has learned to recognize value before others do accumulates things. There were bins of metering valves and plungers and barrels sorted by pump family. There were governor springs in labeled envelopes. There were delivery valve holders and pressure valves for pump models that hadn't been in production since the Carter administration. There were O-ring kits in sizes that no current supplier stocked. There were advanced pistons and hydraulic head assemblies and throttle shafts that Dale had pulled from cores too damaged to rebuild, cleaned and inspected and shelved against the day when someone would need them. The day always came. That was the thing. The day always came. Now let me tell you about a conversation that happened in the spring of 2009, because it's the one that crystallized what Dale Reinhardt's garage had become and what it meant. A man named Harlan Borgman drove down from Franklin County with a Bosch inline pump off a 1972 Alice Chalmers 185 that had been in his family since new. Harlan was 68 years old and had farmed with that tractor his entire adult life. His father had bought it. The pump had been rebuilt once, in 1981, by a shop in Hampton that had since closed. Harlan had called every shop he could find in a 150-mile radius. He had been told, at every single one of them, that they didn't work on inline Bosch pumps, that the expertise didn't exist, that he should look for a replacement tractor. He had driven to Dale's garage as a last resort, he said, not really expecting anything. Dale looked at the pump. He turned it over in his hands. He said, "I know this pump. I've had 3 of these off 185s. He went to the basement and came back with his ledger from 1981 and found the entry. A Bosch inline pump. Alice 185, Franklin County. Customer name Borgman. Fault: low power and hard starting. Repair: advanced mechanism and delivery valves. Parts used. Cost. Date." He showed it to Harlan. Harlan looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "That was my father's pump. He brought it in." Dale said, "I know. I remember him." And then neither of them said anything for a while. Dale rebuilt the pump. He had the parts, not all of them from stock. One had to be fabricated from a similar component, which took him most of an afternoon with a lathe he kept in the back of the garage. The repair took 2 days. He charged Harlan $140. Harlan drove back to Franklin County with a pump that would last another decade, and with the knowledge that the man who had fixed his father's pump had fixed his. Let me tell you about what the ledger meant in moments like that, because it was more than a service record. The ledger was continuity. It was proof that a machine had a history, that it had been cared for, that the problems it had experienced and the solutions that had been applied to it were known and documented. In an age when most mechanical knowledge was being consolidated into dealer networks and computerized diagnostic systems that required subscriptions and software updates and factory authorization, the ledger was something different. It was personal knowledge, accumulated over time, tied to specific machines and specific families, held by a single man in a basement in Eldora, Iowa. It was the kind of knowledge that the modern agricultural economy had decided it didn't need to preserve, and it turned out that the modern agricultural economy had been wrong. By 2010, Dale was 77 years old. He moved more slowly than he had. His hands were still steady, but he tired more easily, and the work that had once taken him 4 hours sometimes took him 6. Norma had developed some health problems of her own, and there were days when Dale didn't go to the garage at all, days when the phone rang and he let it ring. He had started keeping a list of the calls he couldn't take, the pumps he couldn't get to, the farmers he had to turn away. The list was short at first. Then it got longer. He had never trained a replacement. This was the thing that weighed on him. He had thought about it in the abstract way that a man thinks about things he knows he should do, but hasn't found the right way to start. He had looked quietly for someone who might want to learn, a younger mechanic, someone with the patience and the precision and the willingness to spend years developing expertise in a field that was narrowing. He hadn't found the right person, or perhaps he hadn't looked hard enough. He was not, by nature, a man who asked for help, and finding a successor required a kind of asking that didn't come easily to him. In 2011, a young man named Caleb Dykstra came to the garage not with a pump, but with a question. Caleb was 29 years old by then, farming with his father in Hardin County, and he had been bringing pumps to Dale for 5 years. He sat down in the garage on a folding chair and said he wanted to learn, not just to watch, to learn. He said he was willing to come on Saturdays or whatever days Dale was working, and to do whatever Dale needed done, and to pay attention. He said he understood it would take time. He said he wasn't in a hurry. Dale looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You know, this work doesn't pay what it used to." Caleb said he knew. Dale said, "You know, most of the pumps I see are older than you are." Caleb said that was fine. Dale said, "All right, come Saturday." Let me tell you about the next 2 years, because they mattered more than anyone understood at the time. Caleb came every Saturday. He came in the morning and stayed until Dale sent him home, which was usually late afternoon. He started by watching, standing beside the bench while Dale worked, asking questions when Dale paused, staying quiet when Dale was concentrating. Dale explained what he was doing as he did it, not in a formal instructional way, but in the way a man explains things to someone he has decided to trust. He talked about the tolerances. He talked about what the test stand numbers meant and what they were supposed to be and why they were different for different applications. He talked about the failure patterns he'd seen over 50 years and what they pointed to and what they didn't. He talked about the parts, which ones were first, which ones were available, which ones had to be fabricated, which substitutions worked and which ones didn't. Caleb took notes, not on a phone, not on a tablet, in a notebook, a spiral-bound one that he kept in his jacket pocket, and which he filled and replaced and filled again over the course of those 2 years. He was methodical and patient, and he asked good questions, and Dale, who had not had a student in many years, found that he liked teaching more than he had expected to. In the spring of 2012, Dale let Caleb do his first complete rebuild, a Stanadyne DB4 off a John Deere 402. With Dale watching and occasionally correcting and mostly letting him work. The pump came off the test stand in specification. Dale said, "Good." That was all he said. For Dale Reinhardt, that was high praise. Let me tell you about the fall of 2013, because that's when things became urgent in a way that could no longer be deferred. Dale had a second cardiac event in September, less severe than the first, but serious enough that his doctor told him clearly that he needed to stop doing physical work of the kind the garage required. He was 80 years old. He had been working on diesel injection pumps for 63 years. He sat in the house for 2 weeks after the doctor's visit, and then he called Caleb and told him what the doctor had said, and he said, "I need you to take the stand." What he meant was the Hartridge test stand. What he meant was the parts inventory. What he meant was the ledgers. What he meant was everything. Caleb was 31 years old, farming full-time, not in a position to open a shop or run a business from a fixed location. But he had a large machine shed on the farm, and he had the 2 years of training, and he had the notebooks, and he had Dale's phone number for the questions he couldn't answer from memory. They worked out an arrangement. Caleb took the test stand and the tools and the parts inventory. The ledgers stayed with Dale, but Caleb could call and ask about any entry. Dale would answer the phone as long as he was able. The test stand was loaded onto a flatbed trailer on a Saturday in October, along with the tool cabinets and the parts shelves and the bins of labeled components. Norma stood in the driveway and watched it go. Dale stood beside her. He didn't say much, but Caleb noticed, as he was pulling out of the driveway, that Dale had his hand on the fender of the trailer for a moment, just resting it there, before he let go. Let me tell you about what Caleb Dykstra built in that machine shed, because it was not a replica of Reinhardt Diesel. It was something different. He didn't open a shop. He didn't advertise. He did exactly what Dale had done in the garage. He answered the phone when farmers called, and he said bring it by, and he fixed it. But he was 31, not 77, and he was faster, and he had more capacity, and over the course of the next several years he began to take on the volume that Dale had turned away in his later years. He also did something Dale had not done. He started documenting what he learned in a way that could be shared. The notebooks became a more systematic record. He photographed procedures. He wrote up failure analyses. He built, slowly and without any particular plan, a body of documentation that captured what Dale had taught him in a form that was transferable. He called Dale regularly, not every week, but often enough. He would describe a pump he hadn't seen before, a failure pattern that didn't match what he'd learned, a calibration question he couldn't resolve from the specifications. Dale would listen and then say what he thought, drawing on 63 years of pattern recognition that Caleb was still only beginning to accumulate. These conversations were, in their way, a continuation of the Saturday sessions in the garage. The teaching had not stopped. It had just changed form. Dale Reinhardt died in March of 2016. He was 83 years old. The obituary in the Eldora newspaper ran a paragraph about his career and mentioned that he had operated Reinhardt diesel for 34 years. It did not mention the garage years. It did not mention Caleb Dykstra. It did not mention the 14 ledgers on the basement shelf, or the Hartridge test stand, or the parts inventory that had taken 30 years to assemble and was now in a machine shed east of Eldora, keeping old tractors running. Norma called Caleb the morning after Dale died. She said Dale had wanted him to have the ledgers. Caleb drove to the house that afternoon and carried them out in a cardboard box, all 14 of them in order, labeled by year range in Dale's careful block printing. He put them on a shelf in the machine shed next to the test stand. They are still there. Let me tell you about what those ledgers represent now, because the meaning of them has grown with time. There are farmers in Hardin County and Franklin County and Grundy County who are running tractors today. Not antiques, not showpieces, but working machines that pull real loads and plant real acres. Because a pump that came off one of those tractors has an entry in one of those ledgers, and because Caleb Dykstra can look up that entry and know what was done to it and when, and because that knowledge makes the difference between a repair that works and a repair that fails. The ledger is not just a historical document. It is a living reference. It is used. The parts inventory is also still being used, though it is diminishing. The bins that were full in 2005 are thinner now. Some are empty. The parts for the oldest pumps, the ones for the pre-1960 machines, are mostly gone. The parts for the 1970s and 1980s pumps are still adequate for now. Caleb has continued Dale's practice of buying stock when he finds it, from other closing shops, from estate sales, from online auctions where old pump parts surface occasionally. He has found parts in places Dale would not have looked, because the internet has made certain kinds of searching possible that weren't possible before. But the supply is finite, and it is shrinking, and every repair that uses a part from those bins brings the day of empty bins a little closer. Let me tell you about a morning in the spring of 2022, because it happened, and because it is the kind of thing that doesn't make the news, but that matters to the people it happens to. A man named Orville Heinrich drove to Caleb's machine shed with a pump off a John Deere 4230. Orville was 74 years old. His father had bought that tractor in 1974, and Orville had farmed with it his entire adult life, and his son was farming with it now. The pump had been rebuilt by Dale Reinhardt in 1993. The entry was in ledger number 9. Caleb found it in 4 minutes. The repair Dale had done was a metering valve and a set of delivery valves. The pump now had a different problem, an advanced mechanism that was sticking, but knowing the 1993 history helped Caleb understand what he was looking at and what he wasn't. The repair took 3 hours. Orville's son picked up the pump the next day and put it back on the tractor, and it started on the second crank. Orville Heinrich's son is 44 years old. He has a son of his own who is 16 and who comes to the shed sometimes and watches Caleb work. The boy asks good questions. Caleb has noticed this. He has not said anything about it yet, but he has noticed. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end with Dale's death or with the ledgers on the shelf or even with the boy who asks good questions. The story continues in the fact that a thing was nearly lost and was not lost, because one retired man couldn't stop answering the phone, and because one young farmer had the patience to sit on a folding chair and watch and learn and take notes. The knowledge that Irvin Schaefer carried from the Korean War to a Caterpillar dealership in Grundy Center, Iowa, and that Irvin gave to a 17-year-old named Dale Reinhardt, and that Dale carried for 63 years and then gave to Caleb Dykstra on a series of Saturday mornings in a garage in Eldora. That knowledge is still alive. It lives in Caleb's hands and in his notebooks and in the 14 ledgers on the shelf, and in the Hartridge test stand that is still running, still calibrating, still measuring fuel delivery curves against specifications that haven't changed because the laws of physics haven't changed, and the geometry of a diesel combustion cycle hasn't changed, and the tolerances of a lapped plunger and barrel haven't changed since the day they were designed. The diesel shop closed. The expertise didn't. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for someone stubborn enough to carry them forward. Dale Reinhardt carried them for 63 years. Caleb Dykstra is carrying them now, and somewhere in a machine shed east of Eldora, a 16-year-old boy is watching a pump come apart on a bench and asking the kind of questions that suggest he already understands, even if he doesn't know it yet, that what he's watching is not just a repair. It's a transfer. It's the same transfer that happened in a Caterpillar dealership in Grundy Center in 1950 and in a cinder block building on the north edge of Eldora in 1971 and in a garage on a Saturday morning in 2011. It's the kind of transfer that doesn't require a school or a certificate or a curriculum. It requires a bench and a stand and someone willing to explain and someone willing to listen. That's what happens when you refuse to let a thing die just because the world has decided it isn't worth keeping alive.